Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou was born in the village of Batie in Cameroon in 1986. His parents divorced when he was 6 years old, and he was sent to live with his aunt. By the age of 10, he was working in a sand quarry, digging and hauling sand by hand alongside grown men in conditions that most people in the Western world cannot imagine. He had almost no formal education. He grew up in a place where there was no path to professional sports, no gym to train in, and no one around him who had ever left. Ngannou dreamed of being a boxer from a young age, but there was nowhere to learn. At 22, he left Cameroon and tried to cross into Europe through North Africa. The journey took over a year. He was arrested multiple times, detained in Libya, and nearly died crossing the Mediterranean Sea on an inflatable raft. He eventually reached Spain, was held in a detention facility for 2 months, and was granted refugee status. He made his way to Paris, where he was homeless and sleeping on the streets. He found a boxing gym, then an MMA gym, and his coaches immediately recognized that they were looking at something special. Within a few years, Ngannou was in the UFC. His record is 18-3. He became the UFC heavyweight champion by knocking out Stipe Miocic in the second round at UFC 260 in March 2021. From sand mines in Cameroon to the baddest man on the planet, nobody in the history of the sport has traveled a longer road to get there. Charles Oliveira. Charles Oliveira was born in the favela of Vicente de Carvalho in the coastal town of Guarujá in São Paulo, Brazil, in 1989. He grew up poor. At 7 years old, he was diagnosed with rheumatic fever and a heart murmur. Doctors told his parents that he would never be able to play sports. The rheumatic fever left him in frequent, intense pain, and at times he could not walk. His parents ignored the doctors and put him into jiu-jitsu at a local gym when he was 12. It saved his life. Oliveira took to grappling immediately, and by his teenage years, he was competing in professional MMA. He debuted in the UFC at just 20 years old, with a record of 11-0. But the early years in the octagon were brutal. He lost to Cub Swanson, Jim Miller, and Frankie Edgar. He was seen as a talented submission artist who folded under pressure. Between 2010 and 2017, his record in the UFC was inconsistent, and nobody considered him a title contender. Then something changed. Oliveira went on a run that included 11 consecutive wins, the longest active win streak in the lightweight division. He won the UFC lightweight championship by submitting Michael Chandler in the second round at UFC 269. His record is 37-11. The kid from the favela who doctors said could never play sports holds the UFC records for most submission wins and most finishes in UFC history. Paddy Pimblett. Paddy Pimblett was born in 1995 in Liverpool, England. He grew up in the Huyton area of Merseyside, a working-class community where fighting was part of the culture. He started training at the Next Generation Gym as a teenager and won the Cage Warriors Featherweight Championship before signing with the UFC in 2021. His rise in the UFC has been as much about personality as performance. He is loud, funny, and completely unfiltered. But underneath the showmanship is a fighter dealing with real pain. In 2022, shortly before his UFC fight against Jordan Levitt, Pimblett revealed that his close friend had died by suicide. He broke down in tears during his post-fight interview and used the moment to deliver an emotional plea for men to talk about their mental health. That moment resonated far beyond MMA. It was shared millions of times on social media and started a conversation about male suicide that reached people who had never watched a UFC fight in their lives. His record is 21-3. Pimblett is currently climbing the lightweight rankings and building a fan base that treats him like the next coming of Conor McGregor. But the moment people will remember most from his career so far has nothing to do with fighting. It is the moment he stood in the octagon with tears in his eyes and told men that it is okay to cry. Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib Nurmagomedov was born in 1988 in the village of Sildi in the mountains of Dagestan, Russia. His father, Abdulmanap, was a decorated combat sambo coach who began training Khabib almost from the moment he could walk. There is footage of a young Khabib wrestling a bear. That is not a metaphor. He literally wrestled a bear as a child, because in Dagestan, that is what they considered training. The region is one of the most dangerous in Russia, with a history of armed conflict, poverty, and limited opportunity. Abdulmanap built a gym in the mountains and trained dozens of young men from the area, turning them into some of the most dominant fighters in MMA history. Khabib moved to the United States in his early 20s and began fighting in the UFC in 2012. His record is 29-0. He never lost a professional fight. He won the UFC lightweight championship by beating Al Iaquinta at UFC 223 in April 2018 and defended it against Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, and Justin Gaethje. He retired in 2020 after his father died from complications related to COVID-19 and a stroke. Khabib had promised his mother that he would stop fighting, and he kept that promise. He walked away undefeated at 29-0, one of the most dominant records in the history of combat sports, built in the mountains of Dagestan by a father who never got to see the final chapter. Ronda Rousey. Ronda Rousey was born in 1987 in Riverside, California. Her mother, Anne Maria DeMars, was the first American to win a World Judo Championship in 1984. Her father, Ron Rousey, was diagnosed with a rare blood disorder, and when Ronda was 8 years old, he took his own life. He died by suicide in the family garage, while Ronda and her sister were watching television in the living room. Rousey has spoken about how that loss shaped everything that came after. She was angry, directionless, and struggling in school. Her mother pushed her into judo, and Rousey turned out to be a prodigy. She won a bronze medal at the 2008 Beijing Olympics at age 21, becoming the first American woman to medal in Olympic judo in 16 years. After the Olympics, she was broke, living out of her car, and bartending to survive. She transitioned to MMA, and within 2 years, she was the Strikeforce bantamweight champion. When the UFC created its women's division in 2013, Rousey was named the inaugural bantamweight champion. Her record is 12-2. She finished her first 6 UFC opponents in under a combined 15 minutes. She armbarred Miesha Tate, Sarah McMahon, and Kat Zingano in a combined 98 seconds. She was the most dominant fighter in any division in the UFC for 3 years. Then, Holly Holm knocked her out with a head kick at UFC 193, and Amanda Nunes destroyed her in 48 seconds at UFC 207. Rousey never fought again. But she did not just change women's MMA, she created it. Without Ronda Rousey, there is no women's division in the UFC. Daniel Cormier. Daniel Cormier was born in 1979 in Lafayette, Louisiana. He grew up in a small town in a family that dealt with tragedy from the beginning. His father was shot and killed on Thanksgiving Day in 1986 when Cormier was 7 years old. His cousin was also murdered in a separate incident. Cormier channeled that pain into wrestling and became one of the most decorated amateur wrestlers in American history. He was a 2-time Olympic team member who competed in the 2004 Athens Games and the 2008 Beijing Games. At the 2008 Olympics, he was forced to withdraw from competition because his kidneys began shutting down during his weight cut. Then, in June 2003, his 3-month-old daughter Kaden was killed in a car accident when a driver crashed into the vehicle she was in. Cormier has spoken about burying his daughter and remembering how small her casket was. He considered giving up everything, but decided to keep fighting. He transitioned to MMA and went on to become a 2-division UFC champion at light heavyweight and heavyweight, with a record of 22-3 and 1 no contest. He beat Anthony Johnson, Alexander Gustafsson, Volkan Oezdemir, Stipe Miocic, and Derek Lewis. The man who lost his father, his cousin, and his infant daughter became one of the greatest fighters in the history of the sport. Georges St-Pierre. Georges St-Pierre was born in 1981 in Saint-Isidore, Quebec, a quiet town of about 2,000 people. As a child, he was relentlessly bullied by older classmates. One incident in particular shaped his life. A group of boys stole his clothes and his money and left him humiliated. His father introduced him to Kyokushin karate at age 7 to help him defend himself, and that decision changed everything. St-Pierre fell in love with martial arts and began training in multiple disciplines, including Brazilian jiu-jitsu, boxing, and wrestling. He worked as a garbage man to fund his early training because his family could not afford the gym fees. By his early 20s, he was fighting in the UFC, and at 23 years old, he won the welterweight championship for the first time by defeating Matt Hughes at UFC 65. He lost it to Matt Serra in one of the biggest upsets in UFC history, but won it back and then defended it 9 consecutive times, beating every top contender the division had to offer. His record is 26-2. He retired, came back 4 years later, and won the middleweight championship from Michael Bisping at UFC 217 to become a 2-division champion. The bullied kid from a tiny town in Quebec became one of the 2 or 3 greatest fighters who ever lived. Israel Adesanya. Israel Adesanya was born in Lagos, Nigeria in 1989. When he was 10 years old, his family moved to Rotorua, New Zealand. He was the only black kid in his school. The culture shock was immediate and severe. He has spoken about being told to go back to his country by classmates who rode past his house on bikes. He was bullied for years because of his race and because he did not fit in. He did not turn to sports, he turned to anime. He watched Naruto and Death Note and escaped into Japanese animation while the world around him was hostile. Eventually, the bullying pushed him toward martial arts. He walked into a kickboxing gym and discovered that he was extraordinarily talented. He racked up over 75 professional kickboxing fights and built a record that made him one of the most decorated strikers in combat sports before he ever set foot in the UFC. Once he arrived in the octagon, his rise was immediate. He went 20-0 to start his career and won the UFC middleweight championship by defeating Robert Whittaker at UFC 243 in front of over 57,000 fans in Melbourne. His record is 24-4. The kid from Nigeria who was bullied in New Zealand because of the color of his skin became the most technically advanced striker in UFC history. Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier was born in 1989 in Lafayette, Louisiana. He grew up in a rough area and dropped out of school in the 9th grade. He was getting into fights on the street, running with the wrong crowd, and heading toward a life that would have ended in jail or worse. He found an MMA gym, and it gave him direction. Poirier has spoken about how martial arts literally saved his life, because without it, he had no path. He turned professional at age 18 and was fighting in regional promotions across Louisiana before the UFC signed him. His early career was marked by devastating losses to Conor McGregor and Cub Swanson that made people question whether he had the chin to compete at the highest level. He reinvented himself, moved up to lightweight, and went on one of the greatest runs in the division's history. He beat Max Holloway for the interim title at UFC 236, knocked out Conor McGregor in a rematch at UFC 257, and submitted McGregor in a trilogy fight at UFC 264. His record is 30-10 with one no contest. Outside the cage, he founded the Good Fight Foundation, a charity that has raised millions for communities in Louisiana. He has donated meals, school supplies, and disaster relief funds to the area where he grew up. Poirier went from a 9th grade dropout heading for trouble to one of the most respected fighters and human beings in the history of the sport. Derrick Lewis. Derrick Lewis was born in 1985 in New Orleans, Louisiana, and moved to Houston, Texas as a teenager. He grew up in a rough neighborhood and was arrested multiple times as a young man. While attending Kilgore College on a football scholarship, he violated his probation and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served 3.5 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. A week after being released from prison, a friend introduced him to MMA, and Lewis walked into a gym for the first time with no combat sports experience whatsoever. He fell in love with it immediately. Lewis fought his way from regional shows to the UFC and became one of the most beloved heavyweights in the promotion's history. His record is 29-13 with one no contest. He holds the UFC record for the most knockout wins in heavyweight history. In August 2017, when Hurricane Harvey devastated Houston, Lewis loaded up his truck and personally rescued over 100 people from flooded homes. He did not wait for emergency services. He drove through flooded streets, pulling strangers out of their houses and into safety. When asked about it afterward, he shrugged it off. That is Derrick Lewis, a man who went from prison to the UFC and then used his platform to save lives when his city needed him most. Rose Namajunas. Rose Namajunas was born in 1992 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to a Lithuanian-American family. Her childhood was marked by instability and fear. Her father suffered from schizophrenia, and the household was unpredictable. She has spoken about growing up in an environment where mental illness created chaos and uncertainty on a daily basis. Her family also carries generational trauma from Lithuania's occupation by the Soviet Union. Namajunas found stability through martial arts. She started training in Taekwondo as a child and transitioned to MMA as a teenager. She won the Ultimate Fighter Season 20 at just 22 years old to earn a UFC strawweight contract.
But it was her knockout of Joanna Jędrzejczyk at UFC 217 that defined her career. Jędrzejczyk was one of the most dominant champions in UFC history, and Namajunas knocked her out in the first round with a left hand that nobody saw coming. She repeated the feat in a rematch at UFC 223, winning a unanimous decision. Her record is 14-8. She became a two-time UFC strawweight champion and an icon for mental health awareness in combat sports. Namajunas fights with a calmness that betrays the chaos she grew up in. She has been open about therapy, about healing, and about using fighting as a way to confront the things that scared her as a child. Cain Velasquez. Cain Velasquez was born in 1982 in Salinas, California, to Mexican immigrant parents. His parents came to the United States as undocumented immigrants and worked long hours in agriculture and restaurants to give their children a better life. Velasquez grew up speaking Spanish at home and English at school. He was proud of his Mexican heritage and wore it on his body, tattooing brown pride across his chest. He became an All-American wrestler at Arizona State University and transitioned to MMA shortly after college. His rise through the UFC heavyweight division was terrifying. He demolished Brock Lesnar in the first round at UFC 121 to win the heavyweight championship. He lost it to Junior Dos Santos, but then won it back in a rematch that was one of the most one-sided beatings in heavyweight history. His record is 14-3. His cardio was inhuman for a heavyweight. His pressure was relentless. His cage cutting was suffocating. He was the best heavyweight in the world for years, until injuries destroyed his body and took away the career he had built. In 2022, Velasquez was arrested for attempted murder after he allegedly shot at a man who was accused of molesting a family member. He spent 8 months in jail before being released on bail. His story went from one of the most inspiring immigrant success stories in combat sports to one of the most tragic falls the sport has ever seen. Max Holloway. Max Holloway was born in 1991 in Waianae, Hawaii, a community on the western coast of Oahu known for high poverty rates and limited opportunity. He grew up in a tight-knit Hawaiian family where resources were scarce, but community was everything. Holloway started training in MMA as a teenager and was fighting professionally by age 19. He debuted in the UFC at just 20 years old and lost his first big test to Conor McGregor by decision. Most people wrote him off as just another talented kid who peaked too early. They were wrong. Holloway went on a 13-fight winning streak that included victories over Jose Aldo twice, Brian Ortega, Frankie Edgar, and Calvin Kattar. Against Kattar, he threw 746 significant strikes, the most in a single UFC fight in history. He became the UFC featherweight champion and defended it 3 times. His record is 26-8, but Holloway's legacy extends beyond his title. He became a symbol of Hawaiian pride and toughness, representing a community that rarely gets recognition on the world stage. He has spoken about fighting for his son, Rush, and for everyone back home in Waianae who does not have the opportunities he has. At UFC 300, he knocked out Justin Gaethje with a walk-off knockout in the final seconds that is considered one of the greatest finishes in UFC history. Stipe Miocic. Stipe Miocic was born in 1982 in Euclid, Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland. His parents are Croatian immigrants. He grew up playing baseball and wrestling and earned a Division I wrestling scholarship at Cleveland State University. After college, he did not go straight into professional fighting. He became a firefighter and paramedic in suburban Cleveland. While other UFC champions were training full-time with world-class coaches, Miocic was working 24-hour shifts at the fire station, responding to emergencies, and then driving to the gym to train. He continued working as a firefighter throughout his entire UFC career because he wanted health insurance and stability for his family. His record is 20-5. He won the UFC heavyweight championship by knocking out Fabrizio Verdum at UFC 198 and defended it 3 consecutive times against Alistair Overeem, Junior Dos Santos, and Francis Ngannou. That 3-fight title defense streak is the longest in UFC heavyweight history. He lost the belt to Daniel Cormier, won it back by knocking out Cormier in a rematch, and lost it again to Ngannou. Miocic is the greatest UFC heavyweight of all time, and he did it while working a full-time job saving lives in Cleveland. The most decorated heavyweight champion in UFC history was pulling people out of burning buildings between training camps. Brandon Moreno. Brandon Moreno was born in 1993 in Tijuana, Mexico. He grew up in a family that made and sold piñatas to make a living. His parents ran a small piñata business, and money was always tight. Moreno started training in MMA as a teenager and turned professional at 17 years old. He fought his way through the Mexican regional circuit and earned a spot on The Ultimate Fighter Season 24 in 2016. He made it to the finale, but lost to Alexander Pantoja by split decision. The UFC signed him, he lost 2 fights, and they cut him. Most fighters would have been devastated. Moreno went back to the regional circuit, won 3 straight fights, and the UFC signed him again. The second time around, he was a different fighter. He fought Davison Figueiredo to a draw in their first meeting at UFC 256, in one of the best flyweight fights in history. In the rematch at UFC 263, he submitted Figueiredo with a rear-naked choke in the 3rd round to become the UFC flyweight champion. His record is 23-10-2. Brandon Moreno became the first Mexican-born champion in UFC history. The kid who grew up making piñatas in Tijuana, who was cut by the UFC and told he was not good enough, came back and made history for an entire country. Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson was born in 1984 in Oxnard, California. He grew up in a household that was shaped by struggle. He has spoken openly about his difficult childhood and the violence in his community. Ferguson was a standout wrestler in high school and college, but it was after college that his life took a darker turn. He has spoken about battling mental health issues throughout his career. In 2019, his wife filed a restraining order after Ferguson allegedly experienced a psychotic episode and tore apart their home. He has since reconciled with his family and spoken about the importance of getting help. Inside the cage, Ferguson was chaos incarnate. He won 12 consecutive fights at lightweight between 2013 and 2019, tying the division record. He threw spinning elbows from impossible angles. He would get cut open and lick the blood off his gloves. He fought with a recklessness that terrified everyone he shared the cage with. His record is 25-11. He won the interim lightweight championship, but was never able to fight for the undisputed title because the Khabib fight fell apart 5 separate times. Ferguson's story is about what happens when brilliance and mental health intersect. He was the most dangerous lightweight on the planet for half a decade, and the sport was too busy making jokes about his personality to recognize that he was fighting battles outside the cage that were harder than anything inside it. John Jones. John Jones was born in 1987 in Rochester, New York. His father Arthur was a pastor. His brothers Arthur Jr. and Chandler both played in the NFL. Jones grew up in a household that demanded excellence. He was a standout wrestler in high school and won a national junior college championship before dropping out to pursue MMA full-time. He made his UFC debut at 21 years old, and within 3 years, he was the youngest champion in UFC history, winning the light heavyweight title at 23 by stopping Shogun Rua at UFC 128. His record is 28-1 with 1 no contest. He defended the light heavyweight title against every contender for over a decade and then moved to heavyweight, where he submitted Cyril Gane and stopped Stipe Miocic. But Jones's backstory is complicated. He has been arrested for a hit-and-run where a pregnant woman was injured. He has failed 2 drug tests. He has been stripped of titles and suspended multiple times. His personal life has been marked by domestic violence allegations and erratic behavior. Jones is the most naturally talented fighter in UFC history. Nobody disputes that. But his story is not a simple tale of triumph. It is a story of a man who was given more talent than anyone in the sport and spent years battling the demons that came with it. Valentina Shevchenko. Valentina Shevchenko was born in 1988 in Frunze, Kyrgyz SSR, in what is now Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. She began training in Taekwondo at age 5 under her mother, who was a martial arts instructor. By 12, she was competing in adult kickboxing tournaments. She moved to Peru as a young woman to train, and while living in Lima, she was caught in an armed robbery at a restaurant. A gunman entered the restaurant, and Shevchenko physically intervened, struggling with the attacker during the incident. She survived unharmed. Her record is 23-4 with 1 no contest. She became the UFC flyweight champion by beating Joanna Jędrzejczyk at UFC 231 and defended the title 7 consecutive times, one of the longest championship streaks in women's UFC history. She beat Jessica Andrade, Caitlin Tukagian, Jennifer Maia, Lauren Murphy, and Tayla Santos. Shevchenko competes at the highest level in MMA while also being a competitive ballroom dancer, a firearms instructor, and fluent in 4 languages. She is the most well-rounded female athlete the sport has ever produced. Forrest Griffin. Forrest Griffin was born in 1979 in Columbus, Ohio, and grew up in Augusta, Georgia. He was not a prodigy. He was not a genetic freak. He was a regular guy who started training in martial arts while attending the University of Georgia. In 2005, he appeared on the first season of The Ultimate Fighter, the reality show that is widely credited with saving the UFC from bankruptcy. Griffin fought Stephan Bonnar in the season finale at UFC Fight Night 1, in what is considered the most important fight in UFC history. It was a 3-round war where both men threw everything they had. Griffin won by unanimous decision, and the fight drew massive television ratings that proved there was a mainstream audience for MMA. Without that fight, the UFC might not exist today. Griffin went on to win the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship by beating Quinton Jackson at UFC 86. His record was 19-7. He was never the most talented fighter on any card. He won through heart, toughness, and an unwillingness to quit that made him the most relatable champion the sport has ever had. Griffin was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame in 2013. He saved the UFC by just being himself. Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz was born in 1985 in Stockton, California. He grew up in one of the roughest cities in the state. His older brother Nick started training in martial arts first, and Nate followed. The Diaz brothers became legends in MMA, not because of their backgrounds in elite wrestling or kickboxing, but because they came from the streets and fought like it. Nate started competing at 18 years old and won The Ultimate Fighter Season 5 in 2007. His record is 22-15. Those numbers do not tell the story. Diaz became one of the most iconic fighters in UFC history when he submitted Conor McGregor in the second round at UFC 196 on less than 2 weeks' notice. McGregor was the featherweight champion at the time and considered unstoppable. Diaz took the fight on short notice, moved up 2 weight classes, and choked him out. The rematch at UFC 202 was one of the highest-grossing pay-per-view events in UFC history. Diaz has never been about titles or rankings. He is about authenticity. He fights how he wants, says what he wants, and has never compromised who he is for the UFC machine. He came from nothing in Stockton and became one of the most marketable fighters in history by refusing to be anything other than himself. Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva was born in 1975 in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He grew up in the Jardim dos Ipes neighborhood in Curitiba, a working-class area where opportunities were limited. He began training in capoeira as a child and transitioned to Muay Thai, Taekwondo, and Jiu-Jitsu as a teenager. His early fighting career was spent in Japan and Brazil before he was signed by the UFC in 2006. What followed was the most dominant middleweight reign in the history of the sport. Silva won 16 consecutive UFC fights, the longest win streak in UFC history at the time. He held the middleweight championship for 2,457 days and defended it 10 consecutive times. His record is 34-11 with 1 no contest. He knocked out Vitor Belfort with a front kick to the face. He knocked out Forrest Griffin while backing up with his hands at his waist. He finished Rich Franklin twice. His style was so far ahead of the competition that he made elite fighters look like amateurs. Silva's backstory is about what happens when you take a kid from a working-class neighborhood in Brazil, give him access to martial arts, and discover that he has a gift that transcends the sport. He is the middleweight GOAT and one of the most entertaining fighters who ever lived. Demetrius Johnson. Demetrius Johnson was born in 1986 in Madisonville, Kentucky, and grew up in Parkland, Washington. He came from a difficult background and has spoken about growing up in a household affected by poverty and instability. He started wrestling in high school and fell in love with competition. He transitioned to MMA and debuted in the UFC at the bantamweight division, before moving down to flyweight when the UFC created the 125-pound division in 2012. Johnson won the inaugural flyweight championship and defended it 11 consecutive times, the most in UFC history. His record is 33-4-1. He submitted opponents, knocked them out, and out-wrestled wrestlers. His finish of Ray Borg at UFC 216
2017, where he caught a single leg and transitioned into a suplex to armbar in midair, is called the greatest submission in MMA history. Johnson was traded to ONE Championship in 2018 in exchange for Ben Askren because the UFC did not believe he was a draw. He won the ONE Flyweight Grand Prix and the ONE Flyweight World Championship. Johnson never had the backstory that made headlines. He was not from a sand mine or a favela. He was a quiet kid from Washington who worked harder and smarter than everyone around him and became the most complete fighter the sport has ever seen. Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Joanna Jędrzejczyk was born in 1987 in Olsztyn, Poland. She began training in Muay Thai at 16 years old and quickly became one of the most decorated female strikers in combat sports history. She won multiple Muay Thai world championships before transitioning to MMA. She grew up in post-communist Poland, where martial arts were not a typical path for women, and she faced constant skepticism about whether a woman could compete at the highest level in combat sports. Her record is 16-5. She won the UFC strawweight championship by defeating Carla Esparza at UFC 185 and defended it 5 consecutive times, the longest strawweight championship reign in UFC history. Her striking was vicious.
She broke opponents down over 5 rounds with volume, precision, and a pressure that never let up. Her fight against Zhang Weili at UFC 248 was one of the greatest fights in UFC history, regardless of gender. Both women suffered horrific damage, and Jędrzejczyk's forehead swelled into a hematoma so large that it changed the shape of her face by the final round. She lost by split decision, but proved that women's MMA had reached a level of violence and skill that rivaled anything on the men's side of the sport. Khalil Rountree. Khalil Rountree was born in 1990 in Las Vegas, Nevada. He grew up in an unstable environment and lost his mother when he was young. By his early 20s, he weighed over 300 pounds and was on a path towards serious health problems. He walked into a gym and discovered MMA. Over the next several years, he lost over 100 pounds and completely transformed his body and his life. He became a professional fighter and made his way to the UFC through The Ultimate Fighter Season 23 in 2016. His striking is some of the most explosive in the light heavyweight division. He trains in Muay Thai in Thailand regularly and has developed a style built on devastating kicks and knees that has produced some of the most spectacular knockouts in UFC history. His record is 13-6, with 1 no contest. Rountree fought Alex Pereira for the light heavyweight championship at UFC 307 in October 2024 and lost by TKO in the 4th round, but put on a performance that earned him respect from the entire MMA community. Rountree's backstory is about transformation. He went from over 300 pounds with no direction to competing for a UFC championship. The gym did not just change his body, it saved his life. Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor was born in Crumlin, Dublin, in 1988. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood, and at his parents' urging, he started a plumbing apprenticeship as a teenager. He hated it. He had already started training in MMA at the Straight Blast Gym in Dublin, under coach John Kavanagh, and he knew that fighting was what he wanted to do. He quit plumbing and went on social welfare to fund his training full-time. For years, McGregor was collecting unemployment checks and training twice a day in a small gym in Dublin, while his friends were getting real jobs and moving on with their lives. He has spoken openly about collecting his welfare check on one side of the street and crossing the road to deposit it in the bank so he could pay his gym fees. His mother was supportive but worried. His father thought he was wasting his time. McGregor did not care. He fought on the European regional circuit, racking up wins in Cage Warriors, where he became a 2-division champion. The UFC signed him in 2013, and within 3 years, he knocked out Jose Aldo in 13 seconds to win the featherweight championship at UFC 194. Then, he knocked out Eddie Alvarez in the 2nd round at UFC 205 to become the first simultaneous 2-division champion in UFC history. His record is 22-6. McGregor went from a plumber on welfare to the highest-paid athlete in combat sports history. Whatever you think of what came after, the rise is one of the greatest stories in the sport. Robbie Lawler. Robbie Lawler was born in 1982 in San Diego, California, and grew up in Bettendorf, Iowa. He began training in MMA as a teenager under the legendary Pat Miletic and made his professional debut at just 17 years old. Lawler was a prodigy. He was knocking out grown men before he was old enough to vote. He fought in the UFC in his early 20s and had some impressive wins, but was released in 2004 after a string of inconsistent performances. Most fighters who get cut from the UFC in their early 20s never come back. Lawler spent the next 9 years fighting in smaller promotions,
rebuilding his skills and waiting for another chance.
He returned to the UFC in 2013 at age 31 and went on one of the greatest runs in welterweight history. He won the welterweight championship by defeating Johnny Hendricks in a razor-close split decision at UFC 181. His title defenses against Rory MacDonald and Carlos Condit are considered two of the greatest fights in UFC history. His fight against MacDonald at UFC 189 ended when Lawler broke MacDonald's nose so badly that the fight was stopped in the 5th round. His record is 29-15 with one no contest. Lawler's story is about patience and perseverance. He was a teenage prodigy who got knocked off course, spent a decade in the wilderness, and came back to become one of the most violent and beloved champions in UFC history. Every type of UFC fight style explained. Grappling dominant. The grappling dominant fighter does not care about standing with you. The moment the fight starts, they are looking to close the distance, clinch, take you down, and keep you on the ground. Everything they do on the feet is designed to set up the takedown. Their jabs are rangefinders. Their feints are entries. The punch is not the weapon. The punch is the door. Khabib Nurmagomedov was the ultimate grappling dominant fighter. His record was 29-0. He retired undefeated as the UFC lightweight champion. Khabib did not just take people down. He made them quit from the pressure. He would chain wrestle, transition to back control, and smother opponents with ground and pound that never stopped. He mauled Conor McGregor. He submitted Dustin Poirier. He triangle choked Justin Gaethje. Every single one of those men was a world-class striker, and none of them could keep the fight standing for more than a round. Islam Makhachev carries that same style forward. He is 28-1 with 16 consecutive wins. He has a double champ holding belts at lightweight and welterweight. His grappling is so suffocating that opponents start panicking the moment he touches them because they know once he has a grip, the round is over. Damian Maia was the purest example of this style at welterweight. His record was 28-11, but his style was singular. He wanted the fight on the ground, and he wanted your back. If he got behind you, the fight was done. He submitted everyone from Chael Sonnen to Rick Story to Matt Brown. 7 consecutive wins at welterweight, all by submission or dominant decision. Pure jiu-jitsu translated into MMA at the highest level. Stand-up dominant. The stand-up dominant fighter wants nothing to do with the ground. They are kickboxers, Muay Thai fighters, or pure boxers who have crossed over into MMA and built their game entirely around keeping the fight on the feet. Their takedown defense is elite, not because they drill wrestling every day, but because they have to keep the fight where they are most dangerous. Israel Adesanya is the textbook stand-up dominant fighter. His record is 24-4. He was the UFC middleweight champion with 5 consecutive title defenses. Adesanya came from a kickboxing background with over 75 professional kickboxing bouts. In the octagon, he uses distance management, timing, and counter-striking that makes opponents miss by millimeters and pay for every mistake. He almost never initiates grappling. He does not need to. His movement, feints, and ability to read rhythm make him one of the most technically advanced strikers in UFC history. Alex Pereira is the opposite kind of stand-up dominant. Where Adesanya is surgical, Pereira is devastating. He comes forward, throws hooks that can end the fight at any moment, and trusts his power to carry him through exchanges. He knocked out Adesanya at UFC 281 with a standing TKO in the 5th round. He has knocked out Yuri Prochazka twice. He is a 2-division champion at middleweight and light heavyweight. His striking comes from professional kickboxing, where he was a glory middleweight champion. Pure power, translated into MMA, technical god. The technical god is the fighter who makes everything look effortless. They are not the hardest hitters. They are not the best wrestlers, but they understand the sport at such a deep level that they always seem to be 3 moves ahead of their opponent. Every strike has a purpose. Every movement has a reason. Nothing is wasted. Georges St. Pierre was the original technical god. His record was 26-2. He held the welterweight championship across 2 separate reigns and retired as one of the greatest fighters of all time. GSP was not the most powerful striker. He was not the most dangerous grappler, but he was the smartest fighter in every single bout. He would study his opponents for months, develop a specific game plan for each one, and then execute it flawlessly. Against Josh Koscheck, he used his jab for 5 rounds, and Koscheck could not figure it out. Against BJ Penn, he used pressure wrestling.
Against Jake Shields, he used distance striking. He was a different fighter in every fight because he tailored his approach to exploit whatever weakness his opponent had. Jon Jones is another technical god. His record is 28-1 with 1 no contest. He used his 84.5-inch reach, oblique kicks, spinning elbows, and unorthodox angles to dismantle every single fighter the UFC put in front of him. He beat Daniel Cormier twice. He beat Alexander Gustafsson. He beat Shogun Rua for the title at 23 years old. Nobody has ever figured out how to beat Jon Jones in a fair fight because his understanding of range, timing, and technique is beyond anything the sport has seen. Pressure fighter. The pressure fighter walks forward and never stops. They do not wait for openings. They create them by overwhelming their opponent with volume, pace, and aggression that never lets up. Fighting a pressure fighter feels like drowning. You can land clean shots, you can circle away, you can try to reset, but they keep coming. And eventually, the pace breaks you.
Justin Gaethje is the definition of a pressure fighter. His record is 25-5. He has earned a post-fight bonus in nearly every UFC appearance because every fight he is in is violent. He throws leg kicks that compromise mobility. He throws hooks that carry genuine knockout power. And he walks through punishment to deliver his own. He absorbs over 7 significant strikes per minute, which is one of the highest rates in lightweight history. But he also lands at a rate that makes every exchange terrifying. Max Holloway is pressure in a different form. His record is 26-8. He was the featherweight champion with 3 consecutive title defenses. Holloway does not have one-punch knockout power, but his volume is absurd. He threw 746 significant strikes against Calvin Kattar, which is the most in a single UFC fight in history. He overwhelms opponents with combinations that never stop. By the 4th and 5th rounds, his opponents are exhausted, and Holloway is still fresh. He breaks people with pace. Brawler. The brawler does not care about technique. They do not care about game plans. They walk into the cage, put their hands up, and swing until somebody falls. Defense is optional. Strategy is a suggestion. The brawler is there to fight, and if they get hit 10 times, they will hit you back 11. Robbie Lawler in his prime was the ultimate brawler. His record is 29-15 with 1 no contest. He won the welterweight championship, and his title fights were some of the most violent in UFC history. His fight against Rory MacDonald at UFC 189 is considered one of the greatest bouts ever. Lawler was cut open, bleeding, and getting outworked for 3 rounds. Then, in the 5th round, he exploded and broke MacDonald's nose so badly that the fight was stopped. That is what a brawler does. They absorb punishment, survive, and then catch you with 1 moment of violence that changes everything. Diego Sanchez was a brawler with a heart that defied logic. His record was 30-14. He won 23 of his 32 UFC bouts by decision because he was never dangerous enough to finish elite opponents, but never vulnerable enough to get finished himself. He just walked forward through everything, throwing until the bell. His fight against Clay Guida is still one of the most entertaining bouts in UFC history. 2 men throwing with no regard for defense for 3 rounds straight. Counter-striker. The counter-striker is patient. They do not lead. They do not push forward. They wait. They let their opponent make the first move, and then they make them pay for it. Every strike a counter-striker throws is a reaction to something their opponent did wrong. A missed jab becomes a straight right. An overextended hook becomes a check hook and exit. The counter-striker turns their opponent's aggression into a weapon against them. Conor McGregor at his peak was the most devastating counter-striker the sport has ever seen. His record is 22-6. He knocked out Jose Aldo in 13 seconds at UFC 194 with a single left-hand counter that ended a decade-long reign at featherweight. He knocked out Eddie Alvarez in the 2nd round at UFC 205 to become the first simultaneous 2-division champion in UFC history. McGregor's left hand was always loaded, and he had the ability to read rhythm and timing so precisely that opponents would walk straight into it. He did not chase people. He let them come to him, and then he hit them with something they never saw. Lyoto Machida was a counter-striker built from karate. His record was 26-11. He used a stance that most MMA fighters had never seen before, standing almost sideways with his feet wide, bouncing in and out of range. Opponents could not find him. They would throw and hit air. Then Machida would explode forward with a straight punch or a crane kick, and they would be on the floor before they understood what happened. His knockout of Randy Couture and his front kick knockout of Vitor Belfort are 2 of the most spectacular finishes in UFC history. Decision merchant. The decision merchant wins fights, but nobody wants to watch them do it. They fight to the scorecards. They take minimal risks. They do just enough to win rounds without ever putting themselves in danger. Every round looks the same. Control the center, land a few jabs, maybe get a takedown and hold position for 60 seconds. Nothing flashy, nothing exciting, just enough to get the nod from the judges. Bilal Muhammad is the modern face of the decision merchant. His record is 23-3 with one no contest. He won the welterweight championship by beating Leon Edwards by unanimous decision at UFC 304. The fight was not exciting. Bilal used his wrestling to control Edwards against the fence, stacked up control time, and won rounds through activity rather than damage. He is an excellent fighter. He is extremely effective, and most fans would rather watch paint dry than sit through 5 rounds of his title fights. The decision merchant wins, but the crowd loses. It is the most effective and least entertaining style in the sport. Psycho. The psycho is the fighter who scares people before the fight even starts. They fight with an intensity and recklessness that makes you wonder if they actually care about their own safety. They throw strikes that should not work. They walk through punishment that should stop them. They fight like the cage is a crime scene, and they are the only one leaving. Tony Ferguson was the UFC's psycho. His record is 25-11. At his peak between 2013 and 2019, he won 12 consecutive fights, in a streak that included victories over Rafael dos Anjos, Edson Barboza, Anthony Pettis, and Donald Cerrone. His style was chaos. He would throw spinning elbows from impossible angles. He would get cut open and then lick the blood off his gloves. He would talk to his opponents while hitting them. His fight against Anthony Pettis at UFC 229 was one of the bloodiest fights in UFC history, and Ferguson seemed to enjoy every second of it. He was not fighting to win. He was fighting to inflict damage, and he did not care how much he took in return. Diego Sanchez in his later years became a psycho too. He would walk into the cage screaming, throw flying knees from the opening bell, and swing wildly, regardless of what was coming back at him. The psycho does not have a game plan. The psycho is the game plan. The drone. The drone does not get excited. They do not get angry. They do not showboat or taunt or celebrate. They just work. Every round is the same. Same pace, same output, same approach. From the first minute to the 15th. They grind opponents down not with power or explosiveness, but with relentless consistency. Merab Dvalishvili is the ultimate drone. His record is 20-4. He won the bantamweight championship by beating Sean O'Malley at UFC 306. Merab throws more strikes per minute and attempts more takedowns per fight than almost any fighter in UFC history. His cardio is inhuman. He pushes a pace that breaks fighters who are fitter than most professional athletes. He does not have knockout power. He does not have flashy submissions. He just keeps going and going until his opponent cannot keep up. Every round with Merab looks the same because every round with Merab is exhausting and there is no break. Colby Covington fights the same way. His record is 17-4. He pushes a wrestling-heavy pace that drowns opponents over 5 rounds. He threw 541 significant strikes against Robbie Lawler. He went 5 hard rounds with Kamaru Usman twice. The drone is not exciting, but the drone is relentless, and the drone is always in your face. Happy to be there.
This is the fighter who has no business being in the octagon with their opponent, but they showed up anyway. They took the fight on short notice. They are a regional circuit fighter getting their first UFC opportunity. They know they are probably going to lose, but they are happy to be there. They smile during the walkout. They high-five the cameraman. They look at the crowd like they cannot believe this is real. And then the fight starts, and reality hits. Chase Hooper was happy to be there when he debuted in the UFC at 19 years old. He lost his first 2 UFC fights by unanimous decision, but he kept smiling, kept showing up, and eventually found his groove with 7 wins in the promotion. CM Punk was the most famous example of happy to be there. The professional wrestler got a UFC contract based on name recognition alone. He had never competed in professional MMA. His record is 0-2. Mickey Gall submitted him in the first round at UFC 203, and then Mike Jackson beat him by unanimous decision at UFC 225. CM Punk was not a fighter. He was a fan who got to live out a dream, and everyone watching knew it. He was happy to be there, The crowd was happy he was there, and everyone was happy when it was over.
Every UFC fighter who went from unbeatable to unrecognizable. Israel Adesanya. At his peak, Israel Adesanya was the most technically gifted striker the UFC middleweight division had ever seen. He went 24-1 in his first 25 professional fights. He won the middleweight championship by knocking out Robert Whittaker in front of 57,000 people in Melbourne. He defended it 5 times. He made elite fighters look like they did not belong in the same cage. His movement was art. His timing was surgical. His counter-striking was so precise that opponents would swing at air and wake up on the canvas. Then it all fell apart. Sean Strickland outpointed him at UFC 293 in a fight where Adesanya looked like a ghost of himself. Dricus du Plessis submitted him at UFC 305. Nasruddin Imavov beat him at UFC Saudi Arabia. And on March 28, 2026, Joe Pyfer knocked him out in the second round in Seattle. 4 consecutive losses. His record is now 24-6, and the last time he won a fight was April 2023 against Alex Pereira. The man who made the middleweight division his personal canvas for 5 years cannot buy a win in 2026. Father Time found the last stylebender, and it was not even close. Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson won 12 consecutive fights at lightweight between 2013 and 2019. 12. He beat Rafael dos Anjos, Edson Barboza, Anthony Pettis, Donald Cerrone, and Kevin Lee. He won the interim lightweight championship. He was the most dangerous man at 155 pounds, and his fighting style was unlike anything the sport had ever seen. Spinning elbows from impossible angles, bottomless cardio, a willingness to walk through fire and drag his opponents into hell with him. His record was 25-3, and he was supposed to fight Khabib Nurmagomedov for the undisputed title. The fight was booked 5 times and canceled 5 times. By the time Ferguson got a title-level opponent in Justin Gaethje at UFC 249 in May 2020, the damage had caught up.
Gaethje stopped him in the 5th round, and that was the end. Ferguson has not won a single fight since.
His record is 25-11. He lost to Charles Oliveira, Beneil Dariush, Michael Chandler, Nate Diaz, Bobby Green, Paddy Pimblett, and Michael Chiesa. 7 consecutive losses after 12 consecutive wins. The swing from peak to decline was the most violent in lightweight history. El Cucuy went from the boogeyman of the division to a fighter who could not compete with the next generation. Tyron Woodley. Tyron Woodley knocked out Robbie Lawler in the first round at UFC 201 in July 2016 to win the welterweight championship. The punch was so sudden and so devastating that Lawler was unconscious before he hit the canvas. Woodley defended the title 4 times against Stephen Thompson twice, Damian Maia, and Darren Till. He had one of the most powerful right hands in the division and the wrestling to back it up. His record was 19-3-1, and he looked like he would hold the belt for years. Then Kamaru Usman dismantled him at UFC 235 in March 2019 over 5 rounds, and Woodley never recovered. He lost to Gilbert Burns by unanimous decision in a fight where he threw almost nothing. He lost to Vicente Luque by first-round submission. He lost to Colby Covington in a fight where Covington beat him so badly that Woodley suffered a rib injury. 4 consecutive losses to close out his UFC career. His final record was 19-7-1. Woodley went from a champion with one of the scariest right hands in the sport to a fighter who looked afraid to throw it. The confidence that defined his reign disappeared entirely, and nobody, including Woodley himself, could explain where it went. BJ Penn.
BJ Penn was a prodigy. He won his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt faster than anyone in history at the time. He won the UFC lightweight championship by stopping Joe Stevenson at UFC 80, and defended it against Sean Shirk in a fight that was not competitive. He moved up to welterweight and beat Matt Hughes for the title at UFC 46 with a rear naked choke in the first round. Penn was a 2-division champion before the term was fashionable. His record in his prime was 16-7-2, but those numbers do not tell the story, because the losses came at welterweight against much bigger men. At lightweight, he was untouchable. Then the decline hit, and it was the ugliest in UFC history. Penn lost his last 7 fights in a row. He lost to Frankie Edgar 3 times. He lost to Rory McDonald. He lost to Dennis Seaver. He lost to Yair Rodriguez. He lost to Ryan Hall. By the end, Penn was fighting on preliminary cards against fighters who were not ranked and losing to them. His record of 16-14-2 makes him the only UFC Hall of Famer with a losing record.
Penn could not stop fighting even when the sport had clearly passed him by, and the final chapter of his career overshadowed everything he accomplished in his prime. Ronda Rousey. Ronda Rousey was the most dominant fighter in any division in the UFC for 3 years. She finished her first 6 UFC opponents in a combined 4 minutes and 56 seconds. She armbarred Miesha Tate twice. She armbarred Kat Zingano in 14 seconds. She was 12-0, and people genuinely questioned whether there was anyone in the world who could beat her. She was on the cover of every magazine. She was in movies. She was the biggest star the UFC had ever created. Then Holly Holm kicked her in the head at UFC 193 in November 2015, and everything shattered. The knockout was devastating, but it was the aftermath that was worse. Rousey disappeared from the sport for over a year. When she came back at UFC 207 in December 2016 against Amanda Nunes,
She was destroyed in 48 seconds. Nunes hit her with punches that Rousey had no answer for, and the referee stopped the fight before Rousey could even attempt to clinch. Her record ended at 12-2. 2 fights. That is all it took to turn the most dominant women's fighter in history into a cautionary tale. Rousey never fought again, and the speed of her fall remains the most shocking in UFC history. From untouchable to retired in 13 months. Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva held the middleweight championship for 2,457 days. He won 16 consecutive UFC fights. He defended the title 10 times. He knocked out Vitor Belfort with a front kick. He knocked out Forrest Griffin while literally walking backward with his hands down. He was the Matrix in human form. His record at his peak was 33-4 with 1 no contest, and he was considered the greatest fighter of all time. Then, Chris Weidman knocked him out at UFC 162 in July 2013, and everything changed. Silva was showboating, dropping his hands, leaning back, and Weidman caught him with a left hook that put him on the canvas. The rematch at UFC 168 ended when Silva snapped his own leg, throwing a checked leg kick in one of the most gruesome injuries in UFC history. He came back, but he was never the same. He lost to Michael Bisping, Daniel Cormier moved him around at UFC 200, and Uriah Hall knocked him out in the 4th round of his final UFC fight at UFC Fight Night in October 2020. His final UFC record was 34-11 with 1 no contest. The man who made the middleweight division look like an art exhibit spent the last 7 years of his UFC career winning just 1 fight. The fall of Anderson Silva took longer than most because even a diminished version of him could survive in the octagon. But the fighter who knocked out Griffin while barely trying was gone long before the record reflected it. Chris Weidman.
Chris Weidman knocked out Anderson Silva to win the middleweight championship at UFC 162 and defended it against Silva in the rematch, Lyoto Machida and Vitor Belfort. He was 13-0 and had beaten the greatest middleweight of all time twice. The entire sport was at his feet. Then Luke Rockhold submitted him at UFC 194, and the decline was immediate. Weidman lost to Yoel Romero by TKO after a flying knee that nearly broke his face. He lost to Gegard Mousasi. He lost to Jacare Souza. He lost to Dominic Reyes at light heavyweight. And at UFC 261 in April 2021, Weidman threw a leg kick at Uriah Hall and his leg snapped in half. The exact same injury that happened to Anderson Silva in their rematch happened to the man who caused it. Weidman's tibia fractured on impact, and he crumpled to the mat in one of the most horrifying moments in UFC history. He came back 2 years later and lost to Brad Tavares by decision. His record is 15-7. Weidman went from the man who dethroned the GOAT to a fighter who lost 6 of his last 8 bouts and broke his leg in the same way as the man he beat. The poetic cruelty of that parallel is almost too perfect to be real. Luke Rockhold. Luke Rockhold won the middleweight championship by submitting Chris Weidman at UFC 194 in December 2015. His left body kick was one of the most devastating weapons in the division. His ground game was suffocating. He looked like a model who happened to be able to fight, and for a while he was the most complete fighter at 185 pounds. His record was 16-3. Then, Michael Bisping knocked him out in the first round at UFC 199, and Rockhold never put it together again. He lost to Yoel Romero by knockout at UFC 221. He lost to Jan Blachowicz at light heavyweight. He lost to Paulo Costa at UFC 278 in a fight that was his retirement bout. Rockhold's problem was always his chin. When he was on top and his opponents respected his offense, the chin was never tested. But the moment someone clipped him clean, he folded.
The gap between Rockhold at his best and Rockhold after the Bisping loss was one of the most dramatic in middleweight history. He went from champion to a fighter who was getting knocked out by everyone who threw with conviction. Cody Garbrandt. Cody Garbrandt won the Bantamweight Championship by beating Dominic Cruz by unanimous decision at UFC 207 in December 2016. It was a masterclass. Garbrandt dropped Cruz 3 times and outboxed one of the most elusive fighters in UFC history. He was 11-0, and his hand speed was the fastest in the bantamweight division. He looked like the next great champion. Then TJ Dillashaw knocked him out in the second round at UFC 227, and Garbrandt lost 4 of his next 5 fights by knockout. The same aggression that made him brilliant against Cruz made him reckless against everyone else. He would get hurt, see red, and charge forward into punches that put him to sleep. He was knocked out by Dillashaw twice, Rob Font, and Kai Kara France. His record is 12-6. Garbrandt went from the fastest hands in the division to the most predictable fighter in it because he could not stop himself from brawling the moment a fight got heated. The talent was extraordinary. The discipline was not. Johnny Hendricks. Johnny Hendricks was the hardest punching welterweight in UFC history. He knocked out John Fitch in 12 seconds. He knocked out Martin Kampmann. He dropped George St. Pierre multiple times at UFC 167 in a fight that many people believe Hendricks won despite losing by split decision. He won the vacant welterweight title by split decision over Robbie Lawler at UFC 171. His record was 17-3, and his left hand was a weapon that could end any fight at any moment. Then USADA arrived, and everything fell apart. Hendricks could no longer make weight consistently. He missed the welterweight limit multiple times and moved up to middleweight, where he was too small. He lost to Tyron Woodley, Robbie Lawler in a rematch, Stephen Thompson, Tim Boetsch, Paulo Costa, and several others. His record fell to 18-9. The most devastating puncher at 170 pounds turned into a fighter who could not make weight and could not compete with the new generation. The Hendricks decline is one of the most debated in UFC history because of the timing with USADA's introduction, and whether the testing changes played a role in his physical deterioration remains one of the sport's open questions.
Dominic Cruz. The type of bad luck where your body destroys your prime. Dominic Cruz's record is 24-4. He was the UFC bantamweight champion with 2 title defenses by October 2011. The most dominant 135-pound fighter alive. Then his body turned on him. Torn ACL in 2012. Surgery. His body rejected the cadaver ligament. Second ACL surgery in December 2012. Scheduled to return at UFC 169 in February 2014 for a title unification bout against Renan Barão. Tore his groin. Pulled out. Stripped of the title. 3 torn ACLs and a torn groin. 1 fight in 4 years. He returned at UFC 178 on September 27, 2014, and destroyed Takeya Mizugaki in 61 seconds. Weeks later, another torn ACL. Another year gone. This is where it changes. Cruz didn't fight for the title again until January 17, 2016, when he beat TJ Dillashaw by split decision at UFC Fight Night 81. 4.5 years between title fights. He was 30. His athletic peak had been spent in physical therapy. The difference is that Cruz wasn't declining. Every time he came back, he looked elite. The talent never left. The opportunities did. In a division built on speed and footwork, losing 4 years of your prime is permanent. You don't get that back. Tony Ferguson. The type of bad luck where the fight simply won't happen. Tony Ferguson's record is 25-11, 12 consecutive UFC wins between 2013 and 2019. Interim lightweight champion. He never fought Khabib Nurmagomedov. The UFC booked it 5 times. Khabib's knee injury. Ramadan weight-cutting issues. Khabib hospitalized during the cut for UFC 209. Ferguson tripping over a production cable at a Fox studio before UFC 223, tearing his LCL. A global pandemic canceling UFC 249. 5 bookings, 5 cancellations. Not one caused by Ferguson losing or underperforming. A knee injury, a religious obligation, a failed weight cut, a cable on a floor, and a virus. Ferguson eventually fought Justin Gaethje as a replacement bout at UFC 249 on May 9, 2020, and was stopped in the 5th round. He hasn't won since. What separates Ferguson's case is that his bad luck wasn't physical. His body was fine. The circumstances around him kept collapsing. Being good enough doesn't matter if the fight never happens. Timing isn't something any fighter controls. Cain Velasquez.
The type of bad luck where injuries erase a dynasty. Cain Velasquez's record is 14-3. He knocked out Brock Lesnar to win the heavyweight title at UFC 121, beat Junior Dos Santos twice in rematches. The trilogy TKO at UFC 166 on October 19, 2013, is one of the most dominant heavyweight performances in history. Most people in the sport considered him the greatest heavyweight of all time. Then, he disappeared. 3 fights in over 5 years between October 2013 and February 2019. Knee injuries, back injuries, shoulder injuries. He pulled out of UFC 180 with a torn meniscus and sprained MCL. By the time he finally fought Fabrizio Verdum at UFC 188 on June 13, 2015, he'd been out 20 months and was fighting at 7,000 feet in Mexico City without proper acclimatization. Verdum submitted him in the 3rd round. His last UFC fight was against Francis Ngannou on February 17, 2019, knocked out in 26 seconds. His knees were gone, his back was gone. The difference between Velasquez and other injured fighters is the weight class. At heavyweight, every fight carries career-ending risk. Not being active doesn't just stall your career, it ends it. Velasquez's talent was never in question. His body's ability to let him use it was. Chris Weidman. The type of bad luck that's almost poetic in how cruel it is. Chris Weidman's record is 16-8. He knocked out Anderson Silva at UFC 162. Defended the belt twice more against Silva and Lyoto Machida. 3 title defenses against elite competition. He looked like the next great middleweight champion. Then a 4-fight losing streak. Rockhold, Romero, Mousasi, Souza. He couldn't get back to the top.
This is where it gets worse. UFC 261, April 24th, 2021. 17 seconds in. Weidman throws his first leg kick against Uriah Hall. Hall checks it. Compound fracture. Tibia and fibula snapped. The same leg, the same way Anderson Silva had broken his against Weidman 8 years earlier. The symmetry was horrifying. Multiple surgeries, over a year of recovery, one more fight at UFC 292, a TKO loss to Brad Tavares. Physical breakdowns in MMA don't follow logic, they follow timing. And sometimes the timing is so cruel it looks like a script. Luke Rockhold. The type of bad luck where someone else's injury costs you everything. Luke Rockhold's record is 16-6. He dominated Chris Weidman at UFC 194 to win the middleweight title on December 12, 2015. Looked like the best 185-pound fighter in the world. His first defense was supposed to be a rematch with Weidman at UFC 199. Weidman pulled out with a neck injury. Michael Bisping stepped in on 2.5 weeks' notice. Bisping was a fighter Rockhold had already beaten. Rockhold took it lightly. He's admitted this publicly. Bisping knocked him out in the first round, one of the biggest upsets in title fight history. After that, injuries consumed his career. Lost to Yoel Romero at UFC 221, herniated disc, pulled from multiple bouts. Returned at UFC 278 against Paulo Costa, lost by decision, and retired. Rockhold held the UFC middleweight title for less than 6 months. He didn't lose it to a better fighter in a full camp. He lost it because his original opponent got injured. A replacement stepped in on short notice, and Rockhold underestimated him. That's the volatility of this sport. Someone else's bad luck became his. Hernan Barao. The type of bad luck where one fight erases everything. Hernan Barao's record is 34-9 with 1 no contest. He had a 33-fight unbeaten streak between 2005 and 2014, one of the longest in MMA history. UFC bantamweight champion, dominated Uriah Faber twice. Ranked number 1 pound for pound by some outlets, he looked invincible. Then TJ Dillashaw dismantled him over 5 rounds at UFC 173 on May 24th, 2014. One of the biggest upsets in championship history. The rematch at UFC on Fox 16 was worse. Dillashaw finished him in the 4th round. After that, Barao dropped to flyweight, missed weight multiple times, and went 1-6 in his final 7 UFC fights. This isn't traditional bad luck. No injuries, no cancellations. But the speed of the decline is almost unprecedented. Before Dillashaw, generational talent on a historic streak. After Dillashaw, a fighter who couldn't win. No gradual fade, no competitive losses. A switch. Dominance in MMA is fragile. One stylistic puzzle you can't solve can erase everything you built. TJ Dillashaw. The type of bad luck that's half self-inflicted
and half genuinely unfair. TJ Dillashaw's record is 17-5, two-time bantamweight champion, beat Barao twice, lost the title to Cruz by split decision, won it back by knocking out Cody Garbrandt twice at UFC 217 and UFC 227, one of the most skilled fighters in the division's history. Then he dropped to flyweight to challenge Henry Cejudo at UFC Fight Night 143 on January 19, 2019. Lost via TKO in 32 seconds. Tested positive for EPO, 2-year USADA suspension. Stripped of the bantamweight title, the suspension was self-inflicted. This is where it changes. When Dillashaw returned, he beat Corey Sandhagen by split decision and earned a title shot against Aljamain Sterling at UFC 280 on October 22, 2022. But his shoulder had been dislocating repeatedly in camp. It dislocated again early in the fight. Sterling finished him in the second round. Dillashaw retired. He earned his way back to a championship fight after 2 years away. Then his body failed him at the worst possible moment. The combination of self-made problems and genuine physical misfortune makes Dillashaw one of the most complex cases in UFC history.
Some of his bad luck he created. The rest was just bad luck. Alistair Overeem. The type of bad luck where the title is always one moment away. Alistair Overeem's record is 47-19 with 1 no contest. Titles in Strikeforce, Dream, and K1. One of the most accomplished combat sports athletes ever. He entered the UFC in 2011 as the most hyped heavyweight in the sport. First title shot at UFC 146 against Junior Dos Santos. Failed a pre-fight drug test for elevated testosterone, pulled from the card. 9-month suspension, title shot gone. Returned and lost to Antonio Silva at UFC 156 in a fight he was winning. Had to rebuild from scratch. Worked his way back to a title fight at UFC 203 on September 10, 2016, against Stipe Miocic. Dropped Miocic in the first round. Looked like he was about to become champion. Miocic recovered and knocked him out. Then, at UFC on ESPN 7 on December 7, 2019, Overeem was winning a dominant decision against Jairzinho Rozenstruik, ahead 4-0 on all 3 scorecards. Rozenstruik knocked him out with 4 seconds left. 4 seconds from a win that puts him right back in the title picture. Gone. 3 separate moments where the championship was within reach. A failed drug test, a comeback knockout, and a last-second finish. The difference between Overeem and the other fighters on this list is repetition. His bad luck wasn't one moment, it was a pattern. The title was always right there, he just never closed the gap. Ronaldo Souza. The type of bad luck where the organization passes you over. Ronaldo Souza's record is 26-10 with 1 no contest. Strikeforce middleweight champion, multiple-time ADCC submission grappling world champion, one of the most feared grapplers in MMA history. He entered the UFC in 2013 at 33 and was consistently ranked in the top 5 at middleweight. 8 wins in his first 9 UFC fights. Beat Mousasi, Romero, Brunson. Perpetually 1 win away from a title shot, but the timing never aligned.
When Souza was winning, the champion was booked. When the title was available, Souza had just lost. The shot went to Romero, to Gastelum, to Adesanya's opponents. Souza kept getting passed over. He knocked out Belfort at UFC on Fox 24 and called for the title shot. It went to Robert Whittaker. Lost to Gastelum at UFC 224, resetting his position. Won 2 more, then lost a split decision to Jan Blachowicz that many scored for him. By the time the middleweight picture cleared, Souza was 40 and on a losing streak. What separates Souza is the type of bad luck. Not injuries, not cancellations, organizational timing. He was elite for years, and the title shot never came. In a sport where 1 fight changes everything, Souza never got that 1 fight. Shane Carwin. The type of bad luck where the window opens and closes before you can step through. Shane Carwin's record is 12-2, all 12 wins by first-round finish. He won the UFC interim heavyweight title at UFC 111 on March 27, 2010, stopping Frank Mir in the first round. A former NCAA Division II All-American wrestler who worked as an engineer while fighting. His power was considered among the most devastating in heavyweight history. At UFC 116 on July
July 3, 2010, he fought Brock Lesnar for the undisputed title, battered Lesnar in the first round, nearly finished him multiple times. Lesnar survived. Carwin gassed in the second round. Lesnar submitted him with an arm triangle choke, the biggest fight of his career, and his body couldn't sustain the output. One more fight, lost to Junior Dos Santos at UFC 131. Then, in October 2011, a herniated disc compressing his spinal cord. So severe he thought he was paralyzed. Surgery on his C5, C6, and C7 discs. He never fought in the UFC again. 6 UFC fights over 3 years. That was his entire run. Carwin had championship-level power and division-caliber wrestling. What he didn't have was a body that could sustain the damage or enough time to realize what he was capable of.
His career window wasn't measured in years, it was measured in months. Every fighter on this list had the talent. What they didn't have was the timing. Injuries, cancellations, organizational decisions, split-second knockouts, a cable on a floor, a pandemic. MMA careers are short. The window where ability, ranking, and health all align is narrow. Miss it for any reason, and it might never open again. In the UFC, ability gets you to the door. Everything else determines whether you walk through it. CM Punk. CM Punk's real name is Phil Brooks. He was one of the biggest names in professional wrestling, a former WWE champion, and in 2014, he announced his transition to professional MMA. His MMA record is 0-1, with 1 no contest. He had no prior amateur or professional fighting experience before signing with the UFC. His debut came on the main card of UFC 203 in September 2016 against Mickey Gall, a relatively unknown welterweight. Punk was taken down immediately, controlled on the ground, and submitted in the first round without landing a single significant strike. His second fight was against Mike Jackson at UFC 225 in June 2018. Jackson's record at the time was 0-1. Punk lost by unanimous decision, though the result was later changed to a no contest after Jackson tested positive for marijuana. What this demonstrated was the gap between celebrity and actual fighting ability. The Athletic Commission granted Punk a professional license based on his pro wrestling background, which involves choreographed sequences and predetermined outcomes. He remains the clearest example of a fighter who was in the UFC entirely because of his fame rather than his skill. James Toney. James Toney is one of the most accomplished boxers in history. He held world titles at middleweight, super middleweight, and heavyweight, and was ranked among the greatest defensive boxers of all time by Ring magazine. In 2010, at the age of 41, he made a single MMA appearance at UFC 118 on August 28th against Randy Couture. His MMA record is 0-1. The fight lasted 1 minute and 9 seconds. Couture executed a takedown within the opening seconds, met virtually no resistance, secured mount, and finished Toney with an arm triangle choke. Toney had no takedown defense and no ground game. He never had the opportunity to use his boxing. What this fight demonstrated was a fundamental principle of MMA that was already well established by 2010, but still needed to be proven at the highest level. A pure striker, regardless of how elite they are in their discipline, cannot compete in mixed martial arts without developing grappling and wrestling skills. The reason this matters is that Toney didn't attempt to develop those skills before competing. He entered the octagon as a boxer and was neutralized within seconds by a basic wrestling technique. His appearance remains the definitive example of why single-discipline fighters struggle in MMA. Emmanuel Yarborough. Emmanuel Yarborough weighed approximately 600 pounds when he competed at UFC 3 on September 9, 1994. He was a sumo wrestler whose strategy relied entirely on his size advantage. His opponent was Keith Hackney, a Kempo karate practitioner who weighed approximately 200 pounds. Hackney immediately struck Yarborough with a palm strike that knocked him to the ground, then followed up with strikes until the fight was stopped. The fight lasted under 2 minutes. Yarborough's overall MMA record finished at 1-2. What makes his UFC appearance notable is what it revealed about the early era of the sport. There were no weight classes, no unified rules, and matchmaking was based on spectacle
rather than competitive fairness. A 600-pound man with limited mobility against a 200-pound martial artist was not a legitimate sporting contest. It was designed to test the question of whether size alone could overcome skill. The answer was definitive. What this demonstrated was the necessity for weight classes and proper regulation in MMA, reforms that would come in subsequent years as the sport evolved into a legitimate athletic competition. Yarborough passed away in 2015 at the age of 51. Fred Edish. Fred Edish competed at UFC 2 on March 11, 1994, as a last-minute replacement.
He was a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo, with years of training in traditional martial arts. He fought Johnny Rhodes in a fight that became one of the most referenced moments in early UFC history. Rhodes took Edish down, controlled him on the ground, and finished him with strikes in the first round. Edish had no ground defense and was unable to apply any of his traditional martial arts training in a real combat situation. His MMA record is 1-1. What makes his case significant is the aftermath. Edish became one of the first fighters to be publicly ridiculed on a national scale for his performance. Commentators and fans used his fight as evidence that traditional martial arts were ineffective in real combat. 15 years later, at the age of 53, Edish returned to competition and won a fight by first-round TKO. What this demonstrated was one of the earliest and most visible examples of the gap between traditional martial arts training and the reality of no-rules fighting. His UFC 2 appearance is still used in discussions about the evolution of combat sports training and why cross-training in multiple disciplines became essential. Kimbo Slice. Kimbo Slice, real name Kevin Ferguson, built his fame through viral street fighting videos on YouTube in the mid-2000s. His reputation was based entirely on unregulated backyard fights where he knocked out opponents with his hands. That online popularity led to a contract with Elite XC, where he became the promotion's main attraction until it collapsed. The UFC then brought him in for The Ultimate Fighter Season 10 in 2009. His UFC record was 1-1. He defeated Houston Alexander by unanimous decision at the TUF 10 finale in December 2009, then lost to Matt Mitrione by second-round TKO at UFC 113 in May 2010. His overall MMA record was 5-2 with 1 no contest. What the Mitrione fight revealed was every limitation in Kimbo's game. He had limited cardio, minimal defensive ability,
and his offense relied entirely on early power. Once opponents survived the initial exchanges, Kimbo had no secondary tools to fall back on. What makes his case notable is the gap between reputation and ability. His fame was built in an environment with no rules, no rounds, and no trained opponents. When placed in a regulated sport against professional fighters, that reputation could not be sustained. The reason this matters is that Kimbo's case established a pattern the UFC would repeat with other crossover athletes. Fame generates pay-per-view buys, but it does not guarantee competitive performances. Artem Lobov. Artem Lobov's UFC record was 2-5. His overall MMA record is 13-15-1, with 1 no contest, meaning he lost more professional fights than he won across his entire career. He appeared on The Ultimate Fighter 22 in 2015, losing to Ryan Hall by unanimous decision. His 2 UFC victories came against Chris Avila and Teruto Ishihara, neither of whom were ranked or considered high-level competition. His 5 losses came against Cub Swanson, Andre Fili, Michael Johnson, Zubaira Tukugov, and Ryan Hall. The pattern was clear. Every time Lobov faced a legitimately ranked or skilled opponent, he lost. The reason he was in the UFC at all is because he was Conor McGregor's primary training partner and close friend at SBG Ireland. What makes his case notable is what it reveals about how relationships and connections can influence roster decisions. Lobov was widely regarded as the lowest-ranked fighter on the active UFC roster during his tenure. Despite that, he continued to receive fights and main event slots on smaller cards. What this demonstrated was that proximity to the UFC's biggest star carried tangible career benefits, regardless of a fighter's actual competitive record. Cathal Pendred. Cathal Pendred's UFC record was 4-2, and his overall MMA record was 17-4-1. Statistically, that looks like a competent fighter with a winning record. The reality was significantly more complicated. Multiple media outlets and MMA analysts scored several of his UFC victories as losses. His wins over Ghassan Umalatov, Sean Spencer, Augusto Montano, and Howard were all either split decisions or majority decisions that generated significant controversy.
controversy. He was consistently criticized for low output, limited striking, and a fighting style that many considered ineffective. When he finally faced an opponent who forced a finish, Tom Breeze knocked him out in the first round at UFC Fight Night 76 in October 2015. Pendred retired after that loss. What makes his case notable is what it reveals about MMA judging. Pendred's career raises legitimate questions about whether a fighter can maintain a winning UFC record while being outperformed in the majority of their fights. The reason this matters is that judging criteria in MMA remain one of the most debated aspects of the sport, and Pendred's career is frequently cited as evidence that the system can produce outcomes that don't reflect what actually happened inside the octagon. Greg Hardy. Greg Hardy was a former NFL Pro Bowl defensive end for the Carolina Panthers who transitioned to MMA in 2018. He entered the UFC with a record of 3-0, all first-round knockouts, all against extremely low-level opposition. His overall MMA record finished at 7-5, with 1 no contest. In the UFC specifically, his record was 4-3, with 1 no contest. His debut against Alan Crowder at UFC Fight Night 143 in January 2019 ended in a disqualification for an illegal knee to a downed opponent. He then defeated Dmitry Smolyakov and Juan Adams before facing Alexander Volkov in November 2019. The Volkov fight was the first time Hardy faced a legitimately ranked heavyweight, and he was finished by second-round TKO. His subsequent losses to Marcin Tybura, Tai Tuivasa, and Sergey Pavlovich followed the same pattern.
What this demonstrated was the ceiling of pure athleticism without proportional technical development.
Hardy had elite-level physical attributes from his NFL career, but his fight IQ, cardio, and technical skills were never sufficient for UFC-level competition. What makes his case additionally notable is the controversy surrounding his signing. Hardy had domestic violence charges during his NFL career, which made him one of the most criticized fighters on the roster. His case raises questions about the UFC's standards for signing fighters with serious legal backgrounds. Sam Alvey. Sam Alvey holds the record for the longest winless streak in UFC history at 9 consecutive fights without a victory between 2018 and 2022. His overall MMA record is 33-18-1 with 1 no contest. He competed at middleweight and light heavyweight over a 7-year UFC career. During his earlier years, Alvey had legitimate knockout power and earned several performance bonuses. His decline was gradual, but became undeniable during the winless streak, which consisted of 8 losses and 1 draw against Da-Un Jung. His final UFC appearance was a first-round TKO loss to Mikhail Oleksiejczuk at UFC on ESPN 40 in August 2022. He was released after that fight. What makes Alvey's case notable is not just his performance, but the organizational decisions surrounding it. The UFC continued to offer him fights through a 4-year period without a single win, while simultaneously cutting fighters with far better records. The reason this matters is that it raises questions about roster management and what criteria the UFC uses when deciding which fighters to keep and which to release. Alvey's 9-fight winless streak broke the previous record of 7, set by former 2-division champion BJ Penn. BJ Penn's record is 16-14-2. He is a former UFC champion in 2 weight classes, lightweight and welterweight,
and is widely considered one of the most naturally talented fighters in the sport's history. His prime performances against Matt Hughes, Sean Shirk, and Diego Sanchez are among the best in UFC history. The reason he appears on this list is the final chapter of his career. From 2010 through 2019, Penn went on a 7-fight losing streak. His final 7 opponents were Nick Diaz, Rory McDonald, Frankie Edgar, Dennis Seaver, Yair Rodriguez, Ryan Hall, and Clay Guida. He was finished in the majority of those fights, several of which were difficult to watch. He was 40 years old in his final appearance and had clearly declined beyond the point of being competitive. What makes Penn's case significant is what it reveals about the sport's relationship with aging fighters. Penn was a legitimate Hall of Famer who refused to retire when his skills had deteriorated. The UFC continued to offer him fights, which prolonged a decline that was visible to everyone watching. The reason this matters is that it established a recurring pattern in the sport where former champions are allowed to continue competing well past their competitive window, often resulting in damage to both their health and their legacy. Tiki Gon. Tiki Gon's UFC record was 0-4. His overall MMA record was 10-8. He competed in the UFC in the early 2000s at welterweight and lost all 4 of his appearances. He was submitted 3 times and TKO'd once. None of his UFC fights were competitive. What makes his case notable
is his training background. Gon was one of the original 3 members of Team Punishment, alongside Tito Ortiz and Rob McCullough. He also trained regularly with former UFC light heavyweight champion Quinton Jackson. Despite having direct access to some of the best fighters and coaches in the sport, Gon was unable to translate that training environment into competitive performances at the UFC level.
What this demonstrated was that training alongside elite fighters does not guarantee that an individual will perform at an elite level. Physical ability, fight IQ, and the capacity to apply skills under the pressure of professional competition are separate from the quality of one's training partners. Gon found more success on regional circuits after leaving the UFC, but inside the octagon, he was overmatched in every appearance. Mike Jackson. Mike Jackson's MMA record is 0-1 with 1 no contest. His UFC career consisted of 2 fights, both against opponents who were also widely considered among the worst fighters on the roster. He lost his debut to Mickey Gall by first-round submission at UFC on Fox 18 in January 2016. His second fight was against CM Punk at UFC 225 in June 2018. Jackson won by unanimous decision, but the result was overturned to a no contest after he tested positive for carboxy-THC. What makes the CM Punk fight notable is not just the result, but how Jackson performed. Rather than attempting to finish a clearly inferior opponent, Jackson spent the majority of 3 rounds showboating, taunting, and throwing minimal offense. Dana White publicly expressed frustration after the fight and stated that both fighters would likely never compete in the UFC again. What this demonstrated was that Jackson was brought into the organization specifically as an opponent for CM Punk, not as a legitimate competitive addition to the roster. His case, combined with Punk's, represents the most extreme example of the UFC prioritizing spectacle over competitive integrity. Both fighters existed on the roster for entertainment purposes rather than athletic merit. Every level of UFC wealth. Level 1. Most UFC fighters are not rich. The average prelim fighter is making somewhere between $12,000 and $15,000 to show and $12,000 to $15,000 to win. That is $24,000 to $30,000 for a fight, before taxes, before paying coaches, before gym fees, before travel. A lot of these guys are working second jobs. They are driving Ubers, teaching classes at local gyms, doing personal training on the side just to keep fighting. Arman Sarukian himself said it best in a 2025 interview: "You are fighting at a loss most of the time." His base pay was around $90,000 per fight, and after 30% taxes, manager fees, gym fees, and coaching costs, more than half of that is gone before he sees a cent. And that is a top 5 ranked lightweight. Imagine what it is like for the guy fighting on the early prelims for $12,000. The UFC made over $1 billion in revenue, and there are fighters on the roster who cannot afford health insurance. That is level 1. Level 2. This is the mid-card fighter who has been around for a while and is making decent money but is not building any real wealth. Think guys like Matt Brown, Brad Tavares, Neil Magny, fighters who have been in the UFC for years, stacked up wins, and earned enough to live a normal, comfortable life. Their disclosed pay might be $60,000 to $100,000 per fight, and they supplement it with sponsorship deals, seminars, and coaching. They own a house, they drive a decent car, and they are financially stable, but they are not wealthy. If they stopped fighting tomorrow, they would need to find another source of income within a year or 2. They are making a living, not building an empire. Level 3. This is the ranked contender or former champion who has headlined a few cards and stacked up performance bonuses along the way. Fighters like Max Holloway, Justin Gaethje, Sean O'Malley. O'Malley has a net worth of around $4 million. He made close to $2 million for his fight at UFC 306 alone. He has brand deals, a massive social media following that brings in money on its own, and he has built himself into one of the most marketable fighters in the sport. Holloway has his sponsorships and has been in massive fights his whole career. Gaethje is a fan favorite who consistently gets performance bonuses because every fight he is in is a war. These guys have made a few $1 million over their careers. They are doing very well, but they are not set for life. A few bad investments or a couple of years without fighting, and that money starts to shrink fast. Level 4. This is champion level. Current and recent champions like Islam Makhachev, Alex Pereira, Ilia Topuria, Israel Adesanya,
Dricus du Plessis. When you hold the belt, you start making real money. Title fight purses can be $500,000 to $1 million or more, plus pay-per-view points, plus sponsor deals that actually pay well because brands want to be attached to champions. Pereira is stacking title defenses and pay-per-view checks across 2 weight classes. Topuria knocked out Volkanovski and Holloway and is building a massive brand in Spain and across Europe. Adesanya reportedly earned over $1 million per fight during his title reign. These fighters are worth somewhere between $5 and $20 million. They have nice homes, investments, and financial security. But even at this level, the wealth is not generational. One bad business deal, one expensive divorce, one lawsuit, and a lot of that can disappear. Level 5.
Francis Ngannou went from making $600,000 for his last UFC fight to earning $10 million for boxing Tyson Fury and a reported $20 million for fighting Anthony Joshua. In the space of about 18 months, he earned more from 2 boxing matches than most UFC champions earn in their entire careers. But the money is only part of the story. Ngannou left the UFC, signed with the PFL on a deal that guaranteed him a high 7-figure purse per fight, plus equity in the promotion and a seat on the global advisory board. He negotiated that his opponents would receive a minimum of $2 million per fight just for facing him. No fighter in history has ever demanded that their opponent get paid more. He is also building his own MMA promotion in Africa to develop fighters from the continent that gave him everything. His net worth is estimated at around $15 million, which does not sound like a lot compared to some of the names on this list, but consider where he started. He was digging sand by hand in a quarry in Cameroon for $1.50 a day when he was 10 years old. He crossed the Sahara Desert, nearly died, was homeless in Paris, and walked into a boxing gym because it was warm. Now he is a multi-millionaire with equity in a major combat sports promotion and a vision to change the sport in Africa. And he did all of this while dealing with the most unimaginable tragedy, the death of his 15-month-old son Kobe in April 2024. That is not just wealth, that is resilience that money cannot buy. Level 6. Conor McGregor is the wealthiest fighter who has ever lived, and it is not close. His UFC career earnings alone are estimated at around $235 million. He headlined the biggest pay-per-view events in UFC history. UFC 229 against Khabib did 2.4 million buys. The Floyd Mayweather boxing match earned him roughly $100 million in one night.
But the fighting money was just the foundation. In 2018, he launched Proper No. 12 Irish Whiskey. In 2021, he sold his majority stake to Proximo Spirits, the company that owns Jose Cuervo and Bushmills, in a deal worth up to $600 million. That single transaction made him more money than every other UFC fighter in history combined. But he did not stop there. He owns the Black Forge Inn, a pub in Dublin. He launched Forged Irish Stout, which is now distributed across the UK and the United States. He has a hydration brand. He has endorsement deals with some of the biggest companies in the world. Forbes estimated his total earnings at over $400 million in 2021 alone, making him the highest paid athlete on the planet that year, ahead of Messi, Ronaldo, and LeBron James. His net worth is estimated at around $200 million. He owns a yacht, a fleet of luxury cars, properties across the world, and custom suits that cost more than some fighters make in a year. He went from collecting welfare checks of 188 euros a week in Dublin to being one of the richest athletes in the history of sport. That is not just wealth. That is a complete transformation from nothing to everything. Level 7.
Arman Tsarukyan is a different kind of wealthy because he was wealthy before he ever threw a punch in the UFC. His father, Nairi Tsarukyan, is a multi-millionaire businessman in Armenia who runs a construction empire. Arman did not grow up hungry. He did not fight his way out of poverty. His dad was buying him supercars before he was old enough to drive. He owns a high-end gaming lounge in Krasnodar, Russia that cost millions of rubles to renovate, complete with top-tier gaming PCs and PlayStations. He has supercars, properties, and the lifestyle that most UFC champions cannot afford. People have confused his story with Ilia Topuria's, with even Daniel Cormier mixing them up on air after Chael Sonnen got it wrong first. But it is Arman who comes from money. Topuria came from a more humble background. Arman has addressed the rumors about his father being a billionaire. He said his dad is not a billionaire, but millions is not enough. Billions is enough. He joked about it, but the point is clear.
His family has serious money. And here is what makes this the highest level. He is 27 years old with a record of 23-3. He is the number 2 ranked lightweight in the world. He does not need to fight. He has said himself that you are fighting at a loss most of the time in the UFC. His base pay does not come close to matching what his family already has, but he fights anyway. He trains like an animal. He competes against the best lightweights on the planet, and he does it for legacy. Most fighters are trying to fight their way into wealth. Arman Tsarukyan already had it and chose to fight anyway. That is the highest level of UFC wealth. Not the man who became rich from the sport, the man who was already rich and chose the sport because money was never the point.
Conor McGregor. This wasn't retirement, it was leverage. Conor McGregor's record is 22-6. He retired 3 times. The first was a tweet in April 2016 during a contract dispute over promoting his Nate Diaz rematch. He came back 5 months later and fought Diaz at UFC 202. The second was March 2019, months after losing to Khabib at UFC 229. He returned and knocked out Donald Cerrone in 40 seconds at UFC 246. The third was June 2020. He came back, lost to Dustin Poirier twice, and broke his leg at UFC 264. 3 retirements, 3 returns. Every single one coincided with a contract dispute, inactivity, or frustration. None of them were exits from the sport. They were negotiations conducted in public. For fighters at McGregor's level of fame and earning power, the word retirement doesn't mean what it means for everyone else. It means pressure. It means attention. It means a better deal. McGregor never retired. He reset the conversation. Georges St-Pierre. The type of retirement with a specific target. Georges St-Pierre's record is 26-2. He stepped away after defending his welterweight title against Johnny Hendricks at UFC 167 in November 2013. Cited burnout, personal issues, and frustration with drug testing protocols, vacated the title, disappeared for 4 years. When he came back at UFC 217 on November 4th, 2017, he didn't return to welterweight. He moved up to middleweight and challenged Michael Bisping, submitted him in the 3rd round via rear naked choke, became the 4th fighter in UFC history to hold titles in 2 weight classes. Then, he vacated the middleweight belt 34 days later after being diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. Officially retired in February 2019. 1 fight, 1 title, done. The difference between St-Pierre and every other comeback on this list is precision. He didn't come back to see how it goes. He came back for one thing, got it, and left. That's the only version of a comeback that works perfectly. Specific goal, clean execution.
No lingering. BJ Penn. The type of retirement where a fighter destroys his own legacy. BJ Penn's record is 16-14-2. 2-division UFC champion. Won the welterweight belt from Matt Hughes, won the lightweight belt from Joe Stevenson. Defended against Sean Shirk and Kenny Florian. At his peak, top 5 pound for pound in the world. Then the retirement started. Lost to Frankie Edgar at UFC 118 in 2010. Retired. Came back. Lost to Nick Diaz. Retired. Lost to Rory McDonald. Retired. Lost to Edgar a 3rd time. Retired. Each time the comeback was shorter and the result was worse. His final run was the worst. Losses to Yair Rodriguez, Dennis Seaver, Ryan Hall, and Clay Guida. 7 consecutive losses to close his career. Every return moved him further from the fighter he was. The talent was still referenced. The results said otherwise. This is where retirement becomes something else. Penn couldn't separate who he was from what he did. Competition was his identity. Without it, retirement felt like erasure. So he kept coming back, and each time, the gap between his legacy and his reality got wider. Penn didn't fail to retire. He failed to let go. Randy Couture. The type of retirement that proved the doubters wrong. Twice. Randy Couture's record is 19-11. He retired after losing to Chuck Liddell at UFC 57 in February 2006. He was 42, knocked out in 3 of his last 5. Everyone agreed it was over. 11 months later, he came back, fought Tim Sylvia for the heavyweight title at UFC 68 on March 3, 2007. Sylvia was 30, 6'8", with a 10-inch reach advantage. Couture was 43. He dropped Sylvia in the first round and dominated the next 4.
unanimous decision, heavyweight champion again. He fought until age 47, with his final bout against Lyoto Machida at UFC 129 in April 2011. Twice, the sport wrote him off. Twice, he came back and won the title. Age was supposed to be the factor that ended him. It wasn't.
What separates Couture from every other comeback fighter is that retirement actually made him better. The time away didn't erode his skills, it reset his motivation. Most fighters come back worse. Couture came back and won championships. That's the exception, not the rule. Tito Ortiz, the type of retirement that just meant switching promotions. Tito Ortiz's record is 21-12-1, longest reigning UFC light heavyweight champion. By 2012, he was on a 3-fight losing streak and announced his retirement fight against Forrest Griffin at UFC 148 on July 7, 2012. Lost by unanimous decision. Walked away from the UFC. 15 months later, he was back, signed with Bellator. Submitted Alexander Shlemenko at Bellator 106. Continued fighting sporadically through 2019, finishing with a first-round knockout of Alberto Del Rio at Combate Americas. Ortiz didn't retire from fighting. He retired from the UFC. The difference matters. For fighters with name recognition, smaller promotions will always offer paydays. Bellator, Combate Americas, one. The opportunities don't stop when the UFC contract ends. They just move. Retirement from the UFC is not retirement from MMA. For marketable fighters, it's barely even a pause. Nate Diaz. The type of retirement where the fighter never used the word. Nate Diaz's record is 21-13. He never announced a retirement. His UFC contract expired after he submitted Tony Ferguson at UFC 279 on September 10, 2022. He chose not to re-sign. After leaving the UFC, he boxed Jake Paul in August 2023, lost by decision. Fought Jorge Masvidal in boxing. Explored combat sports outside the octagon. In March 2026, it was announced he'd return to MMA against Mike Perry under Most Valuable Promotions. 4 years away from the sport. Diaz never quit. He never said he was done. His deal ran out, and he went elsewhere. This is where it changes from the other fighters on this list. Every other retirement here was a statement. Diaz's was a contract expiring. No emotion, no announcement, just business. His return proves that in the modern era, the line between retired, inactive, and competing elsewhere barely exists. Fighters move between promotions, between sports, between organizations. Retirement in MMA isn't a permanent state anymore. It's a gap between contracts. Ronda Rousey. The type of retirement where coming back made it worse. Ronda Rousey's record is 12-2. First UFC Women's Bantamweight Champion. Between 2013 and 2015, she finished every opponent, most inside a round. Biggest star in women's MMA history. Holly Holm knocked her out with a head kick at UFC 193 on November 14, 2015. First loss of her career. She disappeared for over a year. The conversation shifted from dominance to fragility. Rousey returned at UFC 207 on December 30th, 2016. Challenged Amanda Nunes for the bantamweight title. Nunes knocked her out in 48 seconds. Rousey never fought again. Transitioned to WWE. The comeback didn't answer questions. It created new ones. A year-long layoff after a devastating knockout is not the right time to fight the most dangerous striker in the division. Rousey's career ended on 2 consecutive knockout losses instead of 1. Sometimes, staying retired protects a legacy more than coming back. Rousey's return is the clearest proof of that. Brock Lesnar, the type of retirement that was a business transaction. Brock Lesnar's record is 5-3 with 1 no contest. Won the UFC heavyweight title from Randy Couture at UFC 91. Defended it twice. Lost it to Cain Velasquez. Lost to Alistair Overeem. Retired and went back to WWE. In July 2016, the UFC announced Lesnar would return for a one-off fight at UFC 200. WWE gave special permission. Lesnar beat Mark Hunt by unanimous decision. Collected a reported $2.5 million purse. Then tested positive for clomiphene. Result overturned to a no contest. 1 year USADA suspension. Never fought in the UFC again. This wasn't a comeback, it was a transaction. The UFC wanted a marquee name for their landmark event. WWE wanted cross-promotional attention. Lesnar wanted the payday. Nobody involved was pretending this was about competition. The positive drug test just confirmed what the structure already made obvious. Some retirements end because the money is too good to stay away. That's not a comeback, that's a booking. Ken Shamrock.
the type of retirement that went on far too long. Ken Shamrock's record is 28-17-2. He fought in UFC 1, held the UFC Super Fight Championship, first UFC Hall of Fame inductee. His legacy was secure before most current fans started watching the sport. He kept fighting anyway. Returned to the UFC in 2002 after years in WWE, lost to Tito Ortiz, Rich Franklin, and Kimo Leopoldo. Continued on the regional circuit, went 3-9 in his final 12 fights before stepping away around 2010. Then in 2015, at 51 years old, he came back again. Lost to Kimbo Slice at Bellator 138 via first-round TKO. The fight drew 2.3 million viewers. Lost to Royce Gracie at Bellator 149 in 2016. This is the extreme version of the retirement problem. Name value in combat sports outlasts competitive ability by years, sometimes decades. Promotions will book recognizable names regardless of whether those fighters can still compete. And fighters who built their entire identity inside the cage often can't find one outside of it. Shamrock's story isn't about comebacks. It's about what happens when a fighter has no version of himself that doesn't fight. Mirko Cro Cop, the type of retirement that ended better than the career. Mirko Cro Cop's record is 38-11-2 with 1 no contest. One of the most feared heavyweight strikers in MMA history. His left high kick defined an era in Pride. He fought in the UFC between 2007 and 2011, went 4-3, and retired after being knocked out by Roy Nelson at UFC 137. He came back, fought in various promotions,
entered USADA testing for a potential UFC return in 2015, but admitted to using HGH and received a 2-year suspension, announced another retirement. Then, in July 2016, he ended that retirement and signed with Rizin in Japan. Won the Rizin World Grand Prix in 2016, at age 42. Won the Rizin Grand Prix again in 2019, at age 44. Retired for the final time in March 2019 after suffering a stroke. Ended on a 10-fight winning streak, spanning 5 years. Most fighters who come back decline. Cro Cop came back and won 2 tournaments in his mid-40s. He didn't end his career with a sad loss in a half-empty arena. He ended it on a win streak. What separates Cro Cop from everyone else on this list is that he found the right level. Not the UFC, not the biggest stage. The right competition, the right motivation, and the right circumstances to leave on his own terms. That's the rarest version of a comeback, the one that actually works. The rear naked choke. The rear naked choke is the most common submission finish in UFC history, and for good reason. It is the most mechanically efficient way to end a fight on the ground. The attacker takes the back of their opponent, wraps one arm around the neck with the crook of the elbow positioned directly under the chin, and uses the other arm to lock the choke in place by gripping behind the opponent's head. When applied correctly, the forearm compresses one side of the neck and the bicep compresses the other, cutting off blood flow to the brain through the carotid arteries. The fighter being choked does not run out of air. They run out of blood to the brain, and they go unconscious in seconds. Demian Maia was the ultimate rear naked choke artist. He spent entire fights working toward back control because he knew that once he got his hooks in and slid his arm under the chin, the fight was over. Khabib Nurmagomedov's finish of Conor McGregor at UFC 229 was a rear naked choke after a long sequence of ground control that left McGregor exhausted and unable to defend. The beauty of the rear naked choke is its simplicity. It does not require long limbs or unusual flexibility. It requires positional control and patience, and it works against every body type and every skill level. If someone has your back and gets the choke locked in, you either tap or you go to sleep. There is no third option. The guillotine choke. The guillotine is the most commonly attempted submission in MMA, and it is also the most commonly failed one. The setup is simple. The attacker wraps an arm around the opponent's neck while facing them, usually when the opponent ducks their head during a takedown attempt, and squeezes upward to compress the trachea or the blood vessels in the neck. The problem is that the guillotine requires precise positioning to finish. If the attacker does not have the correct angle, or if the opponent can posture up and create space, the choke loses its power and becomes a waste of energy. But when it is applied by someone who knows what they are doing, the guillotine is a fight ender. Dustin Poirier has one of the best guillotines in UFC history. His finish of Dan Hooker and his submission of Conor McGregor at UFC 302 both came from guillotine positions, where Poirier locked the choke so tight that there was no escape. The standing guillotine is particularly dangerous because the attacker can use gravity to increase the squeeze by pulling guard
and dragging the opponent down while tightening the grip. The guillotine catches people because it is a counter to aggression. A fighter shoots a takedown, ducks their head, and suddenly they have given their opponent the most natural choking position in grappling, the triangle choke.
The triangle choke is one of the most elegant submissions in martial arts. The attacker uses their legs to form a triangle around the opponent's head and one arm, then squeezes their thighs together while pulling down on the opponent's head. This traps the opponent's own shoulder against one side of their neck, while the attacker's thigh compresses the other side, creating a blood choke that cuts off circulation to the brain. The triangle works from the bottom position, which makes it one of the few submissions that allows a fighter who is being controlled on the ground to win the fight from their back. Anderson Silva submitted Chael Sonnen with a triangle in the 5th round of their first fight at UFC 117 in one of the greatest comebacks in UFC history. Sonnen had been dominating the fight for 4.5 rounds, and Silva locked the triangle seemingly out of nowhere and forced the tap with seconds left. The triangle requires long legs to be most effective, which is why fighters like Silva, Anthony Pettis, and Nate Diaz have had success with it. But even shorter fighters can use the triangle if they create the right angle and get the correct leg position. The beauty of the triangle is that it punishes overcommitment. If a fighter leaves one arm inside the guard and one arm outside, they have created the exact configuration that makes the triangle possible, the armbar. The armbar is the oldest and most fundamental submission in combat sports. The attacker isolates one of the opponent's arms, traps it between their thighs with the elbow joint facing upward, and extends their hips to hyperextend the elbow. The human elbow is a hinge joint that only bends in one direction, and when force is applied in the opposite direction, the ligaments tear, the joint dislocates, or both. The armbar has been a fight-ending technique since the earliest days of the UFC.
Royce Gracie used it to submit opponents who had no idea what was happening to them in the original UFC tournaments. Ronda Rousey built her entire career on the armbar. She submitted Miesha Tate twice with it. She armbarred Kat Zingano in 14 seconds. She was so dominant with the armbar that opponents would tap the moment they felt her grip on their wrist because they knew what was coming next. The armbar can be applied from virtually any position, from full guard, from mount, from side control, from standing. There is an armbar available from almost everywhere on the ground, which is why it remains one of the highest percentage submissions in professional MMA. The flying armbar, where a fighter jumps and applies the armbar while in the air, is the most spectacular variation, but also the most risky, because a failed attempt puts the attacker on their back with no control. The Kimura. The Kimura is a shoulder lock that attacks the rotator cuff by twisting the arm behind the opponent's back. The attacker grips the opponent's wrist with one hand, loops their other arm over the opponent's forearm, and grabs their own wrist to create a figure 4 grip, and then rotates the trapped arm upward and behind the back. The shoulder joint can only rotate so far before the ligaments tear and the joint dislocates. The Kimura is named after Masahiko Kimura, the legendary judoka who used it to break Helio Gracie's arm in a famous match in 1951 when Gracie refused to tap. In the UFC, the Kimura is both a submission and a control position. Frank Mir broke Tim Sylvia's arm with a Kimura at UFC 48 in one of the most graphic submission finishes in UFC history. The referee did not stop the fight quickly enough, and Sylvia's arm visibly snapped before Mir released the grip. Paul Craig has become one of the most prolific Kimura hunters in modern MMA, using it from bottom position to catch opponents who think they are safely in his guard. The Kimura is dangerous because it can be applied from almost anywhere, and once the figure 4 grip is locked, the opponent has very few options to escape without giving up something worse. The Darce choke. The Darce choke is a blood choke that works by threading one arm under the opponent's armpit and around the back of their neck, then connecting the hands to create a squeezing mechanism that compresses both carotid arteries. It is similar to the anaconda choke, but the arm goes under the armpit rather than over it, which changes the angle of attack entirely. The Darce is most commonly applied when an opponent is in a turtle position or half guard and leaves space between their head and the mat. The attacker threads the arm through that gap and locks the choke
before the opponent can flatten out and remove the space. Tony Ferguson's Darce choke finish of Kevin Lee at UFC 216 was a masterclass in the technique.
Lee was attempting to control Ferguson on the ground, and Ferguson found the opening, threaded his arm through, and squeezed until Lee went unconscious. The Darce is a modern technique that has become increasingly popular because it attacks a common defensive position. Fighters who turtle up to avoid ground and pound often expose themselves to the Darce without realizing it until the arm is already through and the choke is locked in. The heel hook. The heel hook is the most feared submission in combat sports. It attacks the knee by gripping the opponent's heel and rotating it, which twists the knee joint in a direction it was never designed to move. The damage from a heel hook is catastrophic because, unlike a choke, where a fighter goes to sleep and wakes up fine, or an armbar, where the damage is usually limited to ligaments in the elbow, the heel hook can tear multiple ligaments in the knee simultaneously and cause permanent structural damage. The ACL, MCL, and meniscus can all be destroyed by a single heel hook. What makes it particularly dangerous is that there is often no pain signal before the damage occurs. A fighter can feel fine one moment and have a destroyed knee the next, because the rotational force bypasses the pain receptors until the ligaments are already torn. Ryan Hall brought the heel hook to mainstream UFC attention. His submission of BJ Penn with a heel hook was a moment that showed the entire sport what a dedicated leg lock specialist could do. The modern leg lock game, led by grapplers like Gordon Ryan in submission grappling, has transformed how MMA fighters approach the ground. Nobody leaves their legs exposed anymore because the consequences are career-altering. The calf slicer. The calf slicer is one of the most unusual and painful submissions in MMA. It works by placing a bone, usually the shin, across the back of the opponent's calf and then folding the leg closed, compressing the calf muscle against the shin bone. The pain is excruciating because the calf is being crushed between two hard surfaces with nowhere to go. The calf slicer is rare in MMA because it requires a specific position to apply, usually from a back control or truck position where the attacker has one of the opponent's legs trapped. But when it is locked in, the pain forces an immediate tap. There is no fighting through a calf slicer because the compression on the muscle and the pressure on the knee joint create a combination of pain that the body simply cannot override. The calf slicer is more common in submission grappling than in MMA, but it has appeared in the UFC as a surprise finish when fighters find themselves in unusual scramble positions. It is the kind of submission that a casual fan has never heard of until they see a fighter tapping frantically to something that does not look like much from the outside, but is apparently causing unbearable pain. The twister. The twister is the rarest submission in UFC history. It is a spinal lock that attacks the spine by rotating the upper body in one direction while controlling the lower body in the opposite direction. The attacker typically secures the position from back control, threads a leg through the opponent's legs to control the hips, and then uses their arms to twist the opponent's head and torso against the direction of the trapped lower body. The result is a lateral flexion of the spine that creates enormous pressure on the vertebrae and the muscles along the spinal column. The Korean Zombie, Chan Sung-young, is the only fighter to land a twister in UFC history, and he did it against Leonard Garcia at the WEC in 2011.
The twister is so rare because the position required to apply it is extremely specific, and most fighters will give up back control or another position before they allow themselves to be twisted. But the Korean Zombie saw the opening, locked it in, and Garcia had no choice but to tap, because the alternative was spinal damage. The twister exists at the intersection of creativity and danger. It is a technique that most fighters will never encounter in their careers, but it is a reminder that in grappling, there is always something weird and terrible waiting for the fighter who ends up in the wrong position. The anaconda choke. The anaconda choke is the mirror image of the Darce choke. Instead of threading the arm under the armpit, the attacker threads it over the opponent's arm and around the neck, creating a similar blood choke but from a different angle. The anaconda choke is typically applied from the front headlock position when an opponent is on all fours or turtled up. The attacker locks the grip, rolls to create the squeezing angle,
and compresses the carotid arteries until the opponent goes unconscious or taps. Dustin Poirier has landed some of the best anaconda chokes in UFC history. The technique requires a strong squeeze because the angle is less mechanically efficient than the darce, which means the attacker needs significant grip strength and upper body power to maintain the compression long enough to force the tap. The anaconda choke punishes the same defensive turtle position as the darce, but from the opposite side, which means that fighters who habitually turtle up when in trouble on the ground are vulnerable to both. The best grapplers in MMA can switch between the darce and the anaconda depending on which side the opponent's arm is on, making the turtle position increasingly dangerous in modern mixed martial arts.
The rear naked choke. The rear naked choke is the most common submission finish in UFC history, and for good reason. It is the most mechanically efficient way to end a fight on the ground. The attack